Today, we're joined by Matt Duss and Rania Batrice. Matt Duss is an old friend of mine. We've known each other for a long time. He's the executive vice president of the Center for International Policy. He was the foreign policy advisor to Bernie Sanders from 2017 to 2022. He's written a lot of really important stuff about U.S. foreign policy, and I think is an unusual person in that he lives not only at the intersection of politics and policy, but kind of at the intersection between the Washington foreign policy establishment, which he knows very well, and also a kind of progressive activist community that is very critical of that foreign policy establishment, as is he. And wrote an interesting piece just, I think, yesterday in Foreign Policy about his advice for Kamala Harris in responding to Gaza. Rania Batrice is a Palestinian-American political consultant. She served as deputy campaign manager for Bernie Sanders' 2016 presidential campaign and has this year been the media consultant for the Uncommitted campaign. So thank you both so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Very glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
People should put questions in the chat, and we're going to go back and forth a little bit about between the question of where the race actually stands now, and then the policy questions of whether actually anything is going to change in terms of policy. And Ronnie, I just wanted to start with you. As someone who's been really, really involved in Uncommitted, this movement of Democrats who are opposed to Joe Biden because of his policies on the war, I'm really curious what you're hearing and sensing is the conversation now that Harris is going to be the nominee.
I think it's a great question. And of course, Uncommitted came from an incredible group of advocates and activists in Michigan who founded the Uncommitted movement. And of course, it grew and grew. And it's exactly like you said, it wasn't just a frustration. It was a deep pain of not feeling seen or heard within my own community, but then allied communities just really feeling like nothing they were doing or saying was getting through, which is always frustrating. But I do think that there is, I'll say, some cautious optimism at the moment. Obviously, the day yesterday started with a lot of frustration with the first statement that came out. I mean, many of us obviously agree with what happened at Union Station being atrocious, but we also saw that there were incredible protests happening in the Rotunda and elsewhere that were completely peaceful. And it's all reminiscent for us of things like Black Lives Matter and what happened with those protests previously. But then when the vice president gave her remarks after her meeting with the prime minister, it's something that we haven't really heard from a president or vice president or candidate in a very long time, not in my lifetime anyway. No, I shouldn't say, not from a president within our lifetime or presidential contender. And so I do think that there is, like I said, just some cautious optimism that the vice president has this opportunity to call us all in, and she's actually going to try to do that. And I know there's already conversations happening. Obviously, there needs to be more. And of course, we want to hear more from her as well from a policy perspective. That was a great first step yesterday, but everybody here can probably imagine there need to be more steps taken as well.
Matt, before I ask you about the advice that you would give to Kamala Harris and her team, what do we know about the way Kamala Harris sees this issue and how it fits into her foreign policy views in general? It seems to me we don't really have that much to go on, but I'm curious, as someone who's watched her for a bunch of years, what you have noticed that might offer some kind of tea leaf about what her instincts and her views actually are.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I don't think we have a great deal of evidence. We know that as a senator from the state of California, she took certain positions, I think, that we would call just kind of middle of the road, safe, let's just say, and not to use that as a criticism. You know, she would make the usual speeches at APAC, back when APAC had its big public policy conferences. She appeared there a few times, signed the usual letters. But I do think what we've seen from her in the administration, both publicly and from what's been reported privately, and I've also heard myself, is that she really has been one of the strongest voices internally in the administration, focusing on the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. I think we saw a little of that in the speech she gave in March in Selma, which she had been pushing to give, and which I've understood would actually have been much more critical of the Israeli military and the Israeli government, but was kind of softened by the president's team. And I think we saw that reflected as well in the statement she gave yesterday, which I think was equally, if not more significant, coming right after the meeting with Netanyahu. And I think there's been reporting after that that Netanyahu certainly didn't like it. And others, you got Netanyahu and all his various supporters and advocates in Washington who are deeply outraged, I think, which is very, very good news for us. But also the fact that she chose not to go to Netanyahu's speech, along with almost half of the Democratic caucus, That's an important sign. That is very, very noticed. And while we can't necessarily yet determine, I think, the details of her own views, I think the fact that she understood the necessity of not going reflects an understanding of the Democratic Party and its politics today. And I think that is just as important.
Right. Rania, you mentioned that people on uncommitted were really frustrated just about feeling like they weren't being listened to. Do you feel like that has changed at all since Harris became the de facto nominee, or is it too early to tell?
If I'm being extremely honest, I think it is too early to tell. I think a lot of us do want to feel hopeful in some way, especially after nearly 10 months of just complete devastation. But one of the first things that the vice president said was that she wanted to earn and win the nomination. Nobody's under any disillusion that she will not be our nominee. We know she already has enough delegates wrapped up. But I do think that there is an understanding among her and her team that there are a lot of people who are upset within our own, the Arab American community, the Muslim American community, and other communities as well. And so I think they are very well aware that they are going to need to call people in and have these meetings and have these sit down discussions. And then, of course, public addresses too. But that hasn't happened yet. I expect that it will. I'll just say out loud here and now that I'll be extremely disappointed if it doesn't. But so far, the conversations I've had have lent me to believe that they're very well aware. They're still kind of putting the pieces together. Obviously, Sunday was when the announcement happened, and I think it's been widely reported that not a whole lot of people knew. So there's still things in transit and movement, but I do expect that she's going to do that. And I think they're, like I said, just very well aware that they have to.
What are the things that you're looking for beyond what she's already done, which is speak more passionately about suffering in Gaza? What are the things that you're looking for her to do that you think would be significant?
Well, I mean, first acknowledging one, I mean, she is the candidate. I mean, she is not yet the president, and she is still the vice president. So as I wrote in my piece, I don't expect her to drastically depart from Biden's policy as much as and I think many of us would like that, because I think I've said this publicly, Biden's policy has been a catastrophe. And I would love to see a major shift. For the time being, I suggest a few things that she can say. One is talking about actually conditioning aid as required by U.S. law, which is something that Biden has not been willing to do. Another is being very clear, and I think she got a little way toward this in her remarks yesterday, that Netanyahu is very much the problem right now. He is the reason we are not reaching a ceasefire. I also think she could speak with more clarity. And again, we saw some of this yesterday, but I think she should go farther, just about Palestinians' equal rights. One of the frustrating things with this administration is that, they came up with this language around Israelis and Palestinians deserve equal measures of freedom. I mean, what does that even mean? Use the word rights. They have rights to self-determination and security. And so speaking, I think, more boldly about that would be a very, very important sign. And I think all of these are quite consistent with the professed values of the Biden administration. But I think they are things that President Biden has not yet been willing to do.
So let's say Harris does give an interview or comments in which she says that the U.S. should enforce the Leahy law and condition military aid to Israel like we should with all countries under U.S. law. That's something the administration has not done, right? And it would be a pretty big deal. What do you think the political impact of that would be, and what kind of blowback do you think she'd get?
I mean, of course, she would get all kinds of blowback. But let's remember back in 2019, when Bernie and Senator Warren and others were really starting to talk about restricting aid, conditioning aid, Biden called it bizarre. He called it an outrageous idea. He has now accepted that logic. If folks remember the National Security Memo 20, which created a review process, I think it was a redundant review process. But it was still an adoption by Biden's White House of, okay, the concept of conditioning aid is in fact legitimate. I think that's an important breakthrough. So yeah, she's going to get backlash. I mean, she's getting backlash even for the statement she made yesterday. That will continue, but I think she's on very firm ground. And I think this is something Biden missed when he announced the withholding of 2,000-pound bombs, is that he did not tie this to any legislation or any existing statute. He just said, well, I'm not doing this, as just kind of his discretion as president. I think Biden would have been on firmer ground to saying, truthfully, the law requires this. And I think that's something she could say. Now, again, she's not going to want to say this in a way that just clearly says, well, Biden got this wrong, I'm getting this right, even though that would be my view. She's got to be a bit craftier about it, but I do think there are ways to signal that to us.
Yeah. Rania, how significant do you think the conditioning of aid is in terms of overcoming the anger and disillusionment that has led people in Michigan and beyond, progressives, to say that they don't want to support the Democrats?
At this point, honestly, I think that it's a baseline. Permanent ceasefire is a baseline. Conditioning, and I have to just say, I make it a point to say conditioning funding, because to me, aid means something else. The conditioning funding is a baseline. And I think Matt, of course, hit the nail on the head here. There's all this talk in this country about patriotism and rule of law and all these things, and we're literally breaking our own laws. And so I will say, of course, there's been a massive shift. I mean, these are conversations, quite frankly, we couldn't have had in this sort of a format necessarily, well, maybe in this format, but in some other formats in a real way until somewhat recently. But that's literally what we're asking for here. And it is a part of the uncommitted movement shift, is a weapons embargo, is conditioning to funding. Because again, we're breaking our own US laws and of course, international humanitarian laws as well. And so while I do think it is a baseline, I also think it would make a massive, massive difference within the community and those people who've just felt either exiting or are just talking about not voting at the top of the ticket at all and all those kinds of things. So I think it's massively important, and I do think it's a baseline.
And Rania, what is your understanding of what the uncommitted delegates are going to do at the convention? Or is it unclear yet?
I think it's a really incredible group of delegates and leaders that are involved in uncommitted. They're still strategizing. They've been involved in discussions around the platform. Obviously, anybody who's been around the DNC at all understands that's not always a real discussion, but they are inserting our demands into the conversation. And I do know that they're going to continue pushing for permanent ceasefire, an arms embargo, and conditioning to funding, just like we're talking about. And they want to meet with the vice president, which I think is a completely reasonable ask. And we also have to remember, all these uncommitted delegates are not Arab American. All of them are not Palestinian American. This is a very diverse group of people. And one of my biggest frustrations with the Biden administration is this ongoing narrative that the only people that care about what's going on are Arab Americans and Muslim Americans. That's not true. We've seen it's not true over all these months of these horrible things happening. The numbers have just gotten bigger and bigger and bigger in opposition, but the refusal to acknowledge that this matters to a lot of people, anybody who cares about human rights, anybody who cares about peace, anybody who cares about the way that foreign policy impacts even our domestic policy and the way we fund things in the US cares about this issue.
If I could just very quickly
please
follow up and agree completely. All of those were great points, but I just want to underline, it is obviously far more than just Palestinian Americans, Arab Americans. As you all know, Jewish Americans, particularly young Jewish Americans, have been a huge part of this movement, but the progressive left in the party more broadly, Black Americans. And as I've been saying for a long time, and I'm sure you all have as well, Israel-Palestine is bigger than a foreign policy issue. It touches on a whole set of issues around equality, about racial and social justice. Obviously, just in a foreign policy, it is seen, rightly or wrongly, but it is seen as where the global North dominates and exercises its will upon the global South. It kind of is a stand-in for a whole bunch of other debates and arguments and value propositions. And I think that's reflected in the significance it has in this campaign. And that will continue because it really signals where you are on this issue, does signal a set of values that reflect on a whole other set of issues. And I think people are starting to look at it more and more in that way. And the last point I would make here too, just looking at foreign policy, as I wrote in my piece the other day, Joe Biden has a real set of wins, domestically, certainly. I mean, he's an extraordinarily successful progressive president. I'll continue to say that. On foreign policy, I can point to some good things he has done well. But obviously, Gaza is so much more than just a point in the minus column. It is an absolute catastrophe that is going to define his legacy. And I find that very tragic. But it also reflects, I think, a contradiction in his foreign policy approach, which on the one hand has moved us away from a kind of global economic neoliberal model that really promotes instability, it promotes poverty, it promotes inequality and corruption, but at the same time tries to maintain a kind of American dominance and hegemony in this kind of American exceptionalist theology where we and our friends have one set of rules and our adversaries must obey a different set of rules. And you can see that demonstrated so starkly with comparing Gaza to Ukraine, just for example. And I think that is simply just not sustainable. I think that's part of what is driving this upset.
One of the things that's obviously been discussed a lot, Ronnie, is the question of a running mate. And there was a piece in the New Republic by David Cleon, a former Jewish Currents colleague, very critical of Josh Shapiro for some of the things he said about protesters in Pennsylvania and his role at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm curious how much you think that the vice presidential choice will matter, and if there are folks that you think, from the perspective of uncommitted, would be better.
Absolutely. Short answer is yes, it matters a lot. And it's actually, interestingly, I think I've worked in politics for 24 years, and I don't know that I've had this many daily conversations about the vice presidential prospect. Not that those conversations don't happen, but just every day, multiple times a day. I think Josh Shapiro is wildly problematic for all the reasons you just said, and then some others too that don't even have to do with Gaza or the West Bank or anything. I mean, there's some issues around labor and anyway, but I think he's hugely problematic for my community and other communities as well. I do think that there are some favorites. I think Governor Walz is one. I think Governor Beshear is one. There's a lot of, I don't want to say excitement. I don't think that's the right word around them, but there is kind of this, okay, these are people that exist out in the world. There's already executives within their states. They're doing good things. Both of them have really stood up and done incredibly important things within their state. And neither one take AIPAC money, which is another big thing that's been a topic of conversation. A lot of these other contenders that are being discussed do take quite a bit of AIPAC money. And obviously the vice president has taken lots of AIPAC money. So there's always room to grow. But I think, like I said, the short answer is it matters a lot, and it's being discussed multiple times a day, every day, across so many different groups that I'm personally a part of. I'm sure others are hearing the same.
Matt, I'm curious your take on this question of the running mate.
You know, I think we have evidence that the running mate doesn't make an enormous amount of difference. I think, as we've seen in the past, and I think, frankly, are seeing right now with Vance, it can be problematic. Although I do think I was in a minority that found Vance's speech at the convention really effective and kind of a troubling but very helpful map of where that movement, the MAGA movement, is going. But I share some of the concerns that Rania just said about Shapiro that others have raised. I mean, I think he's shown a willingness, both as, I think, state attorney general and as governor, to use the power of the state to suppress nonviolent protest. I mean, he compared Palestinian rights protesters to the KKK, which I think is pretty outrageous. But there's a few other issues relating to school vouchers. Obviously, that's a problem for a lot of Democratic voters. So again, not going to make an endorsement or an unendorsement here, but I'll just say I would love a vice president who is going to be an advocate for human rights and equality. And I haven't seen that from Shapiro.
I just saw a couple of people pop up and asking about Mark Kelly. Mark Kelly, to me, is also problematic in not exactly the same way, but similar ways as Josh Shapiro is. And then, of course, again, he voted against the PRO Act. There's other political legislative issues that Senator Kelly brings to the table. And then, of course, he met with Netanyahu yesterday, and helped me understand why that's necessary. And of just these kinds of things that really cause pause. And Matt's exactly right. From an electoral standpoint, the vice president rarely is like bumping numbers up, but from a very specific within the community, within this movement, within people who care about this issue specifically, people are paying close attention. I think especially because these names are circulating and we know they're being vetted. I mean, lots of people are being vetted, so that doesn't necessarily mean anything on its face. But I do think that Mark Kelly is problematic in a lot of the same ways. Listen, I've worked with him and his wife. I do a lot of work in the gun violence prevention space, and I'm not going to take away that incredible work that they have done and that he has done. But from this perspective, I think he's also problematic.
Matt, I wonder, one of the, obviously, the sensitive issues that always comes up when you're talking about politicians making decisions on this issue is the question of how it impacts campaign funding. And, you know, there was that incident, when was it, a couple months ago or whatever, when Chaim Saban wrote this angry, semi-coherent letter to Biden or about Biden. Do you think that because Harris is turning out to be able to raise so much money that maybe she's insulated from that a little bit? Or I'm curious what you think the pressures are, if any, from a funding perspective about how she plays this issue.
Is anyone insulated? I mean, whether or not the Harris campaign itself needs the funds, a lot of these big donors fund all over the place, down ballot. So I think someone who's able to write an enormous check is always going to have a measure of influence or at least get a hearing because our politics is deeply corrupt and runs on a whole amount of money. It's a complete outlier among modern democracies, the extent to which very wealthy and powerful people enjoy influence. And Haim Saban is one example there. I think even more than the incoherence of the email was just the arrogance that he knows he can just toss off an email and people are going to take notice. It's like, who the fuck do you think you are, man? I mean, I appreciate everybody loves Power Rangers, but on what basis do you speak to our elected members of Congress like this? And I want to add one thing here. Since you brought up Saban, not only is this really gross and corrupt, it is also bad for policy. Back in 2018, Senator Sanders led a letter with 13 other colleagues, including Dick Durbin, about Gaza, citing Israeli security officials, among others, sounding the alarm on the crisis in Gaza, saying, if we do not address this crisis, it could lead to all-out war. Their words, this is what we have now. That's where it led. We should have listened. But at the time, Haim Saban sent another one of these cranky emails to every co-signer with Bernie, warning them not to sign any more Bernie letters. Not only is it arrogant and rude, it's just wrong on the policy. We had an opportunity to listen to address the Gaza crisis before it erupted into October 7. And Haim Saban is one of these guys who's just constantly trying to mute the alarm. And I think we really do need to understand on a policy level how destructive that is.
Yeah, I met Haim Saban once. I was actually at his house, and he reminded me a lot of certain older members of my family that I grew up with, for whom I have a real affection, but I would never, ever have wanted those people to be in charge of U.S. foreign policy.
Right.
On this issue or frankly anything else. I then imagine what would have happened to some of those folks who I knew as a kid if someone had just dumped $1 billion in their lap and what they would have done with it. It's a very scary thing.
Yeah, you can create an enormous amount of mischief with.
Yes. Ronnie, a couple of people have been asking about the governor of North Carolina, Governor Cooper, and I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about him.
Okay, how can I say this artfully? He's okay. He's all right. I will say he has a team around him that's pretty sympathetic. He has done some problematic things. He's not my first, second, or third choice, but I would put him above Mark Kelly and Josh Shapiro. And also, I hate to say this, but it's true. Politics is a game of aesthetics as well. And I just feel like Roy Cooper's okay. He's older, and I am sort of done with that. I'm so sick of being like handing the last however many decades the vice president has been the nominee in the following cycles. And I'm just kind of done with that. We've done it. It's not okay. It's time to keep passing the torch, not just one and done. And obviously, this is VP nominee again. We've got a lot of work to do on Vice President Harris herself. But yeah, he's, like I said, just not my first choice. Or third.
Speaking of passing the torch, there's been some discussion about Pete Buttigieg. He's a great speaker, and some people have mentioned Bill Clinton choosing Al Gore as a kind of a generational. Rania, what do you think about the Buttigieg choice as an idea?
I have to try to be diplomatic again. You're making this really hard.
No,
Peter.
Please don't be diplomatic.
So I've had some personal experience with the secretary, and no one can say he's not brilliant. I mean, he is absolutely brilliant. He's a great speaker. There's a lot of really wonderful things about him. In my past conversations with him, he could not be bothered with the issue of Palestine. Just absolutely could not be bothered. And for me, I'm done, and I hate to say it that way. And I feel like I've just gotten worse every year older I get, but especially where we are now. And none of us have unrealistic expectations that tomorrow everything's going to change. But at minimum, I feel like we have to have somebody who's willing to have conversations and learn. And to me, that's not who he is.
Right. Matt, you were Bernie Sanders' top foreign policy advisor for 5 years. So you know how much foreign policy staff matter. I'm curious what you think we should make of the people that Harris has had around her, particularly. I think Philip Gordon was her foreign policy advisor, at least for part of the time as vice president.
Now he's still her national security advisor.
Okay. So I'm curious if you see any differences between the people that she's had around her and the people that Biden have had around him.
I know Phil, he's a very good guy, very smart. He's not like a raging progressive, but I mean, I would say he is one of the more thoughtful people in the center-left foreign policy establishment, and I'll take it. I also know like he wrote a book a few years ago about the danger of regime change, looking at the lessons of the past 2 decades. And I will say that kind of self-criticism of past views, which I also credit you, Peter, of having written quite thoughtfully about this stuff. I mean, that's very rare. So I also credit Phil with that. There are a few other people I could name, but I also want to say, I think you can point to some people in the Harris orbit with views that are more to the right or more to the left. But I also think the very key thing here is that the fact that her views aren't formed hard and fast, have not been cast in stone for the past 40 years is really important, because staffing is important. But so are the views of the principal, the boss. And in this case, particularly on this issue we are discussing, as everyone here, I'm sure, is well aware, Biden has had very firm and, in my view, very outdated views for a long time. And that is part of what has constrained this policy and led us to this really disastrous place. So even just being open, if I can't point to a whole list of great people around Harris, although I can name a few great people, I think just the fact that there's more openness and possibility to helping construct and develop a new vision for American foreign policy and for U.S. policy toward Israel-Palestine is a real plus.
And Matt, what do you make of the reports that Blinken and Sullivan would not be kept on if she were to become the president?
I think that makes a lot of sense. Blinken, in particular, has been a Biden staffer for a long time. I think she would definitely want to bring on her own team. That's to be expected.
Rania, who would be your dream team for Harris foreign policy advisors?
Well, Matt Duss, obviously, to start.
He's a dangerous character. You should be careful.
But dangerous in all the right ways. So I might push that. Sorry, not sorry. I'm kind of with Matt on Phil. I like him. And I do want to just say one thing that I don't think is necessarily globally known. Oftentimes, staff are who stand in the way. Oftentimes, staff are the ones you could get somewhere with a member of Congress, with the president. And then oftentimes it is staff who will then obstruct that progress. And so I'm naming that because we're all human and we all have agendas. And that's the thing, too. This is what was really upsetting to me, not to belabor the point, but Biden was not doing well and he was not calling all the shots. And whether anybody wants to admit that or not doesn't matter. I've been around the man for 20 years. Anyone who's been around him for any amount of time knew he was not doing well. So you had Jake Sullivan and Blinken and these folks running the show, and that does not take blame away from him. Biden did all of his own atrocious things too. But these are the kinds of things that happen. People's personal agendas take over if you don't have somebody who is necessarily thoughtful enough to step in and say, give me all the information. I want to have the full conversation. And some really great leaders will listen to all sides. That sounds so trite in some ways, but they will. And then they'll take all of the information and process it. But I'm just naming that to say staff is really, really, really important as we move forward. So I'm half joking about Matt, but I'm not, because Matt, I love you, but also you're a very thoughtful, smart person. So to me, that's what we want. Somebody who can understand the nuance, understand the history, understand that there is political powers at play, and then there's a very real on the ground logistical powers at play. So Phil sticking around is great. Getting rid of Biden's current foreign policy folks, I did a little cheer when I saw that being reported out, because it's been so bad. And I've been in the rooms with these people, as have other members of my community, where they just have done and said the most atrocious things. And I will never point a privilege here. I'll never believe that that's about anything aside from racism. Because I think Matt mentioned, when you look at Ukraine and Palestine side by side, and you have a member of the Biden team in tears over dead Ukrainian children, right. And then the most callous, inhumane, disgusting response, oh, that's just the price of war, when we're talking about dead Palestinian children. I mean, that is, to me, nothing more than racism. So it'd be great if we didn't have a bunch of racist people running around the White House.
Matt, when I think about, besides you, when I think about who I would want Paris to have around her, I actually have trouble coming up with names, and I follow this stuff. And I wonder, is there actually a pipeline of people? Because generally people have junior jobs and they have more senior jobs and they work in a set of institutions. And so is there a pipeline that exists of people who could enter into significant foreign policy positions who have a different worldview, or does it just not exist?
It's a great question. And I would say part of the challenge, as someone who's been part of this project of building up a progressive foreign policy cohort, One of the things we do lack, part of developing those muscles and developing that bench is people who have served in lower level and then medium level positions, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, and then are ready to move up. And we have a few of those who went into the Biden administration, but that's still a nascent project in a lot of ways. So there are a number of folks I could reel off who I think would be good in positions. I don't want to get anyone in trouble being endorsed by a shady character like me. But I'll just say one person is my good friend Sarah Margon, who was nominated as an Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Rights, and Labor, and was stonewalled by the Republicans. And frankly, in my view, was not served well by the Biden administration, who kind of just did not push, in my view, nearly hard enough. I mean, having been in the Senate, I know what it looks like when an administration is getting it back behind a nominee, and that did not happen for Sarah, which I think is disappointing. She's quite a brilliant foreign policy professional. I think she'd be great for something. That's just one. I'm happy to run down a few other names. I mean, there are folks who are inside now who could possibly stay in other roles. We had Andrew Miller, again, who was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Israel and Palestine, who just left the State Department about a month ago. Really smart, really committed to human rights, I think is one of those people who really work in an administration and working for a president who it's very clear does not prioritize Palestinian rights at all. So those are just two names who now I hope I have not sunk their possibility of their being chosen. But I think getting back to the original point I was making, yeah, that is part of the project, is getting people in at lower and medium levels and getting them the training and experience to be able to serve at the higher levels.
Right. And Ronnie, there's also the question of whether a president has support in Congress so that they can decide that they're going to take on a certain position and not have overwhelming blowback inside their own party. I'm curious where you think that stands in the Democratic Party right now. On the one hand, there were a lot of people that didn't show up at Netanyahu's speech. On the other hand, it's not been so far a great year in terms of electing people who are more progressive on this issue. It sometimes seems to me like we're going backwards. You look at Jamal Bowman, and I don't know of, you may know, I don't know of a single Democrat who is facing any political challenge in the Democratic Party in terms of their getting reelected because of the position they've taken on this war, which is kind of amazing to me given how much energy there is, right? So I'm curious whether you think we're in a position where Kamala Harris could get political support for taking a different view among Democrats in her own party in Congress.
Real quick, I just want to address one thing about Congress. I think you're exactly right as far as it being very helpful, obviously, when a president has the support of the House and the Senate. But I also just want to name that the president bypassed Congress twice to send more weapons to Israel. So there's also a lot of damage that can be done, whether or not there is support at the very top there. So I'm just saying that out loud because it's important, I think. But as far as what you're talking about from an electoral front, I think the reality is, and Matt said this earlier, the way that our system works, I often get a little bristly when people say it's broken. It's not broken. It works exactly like it's meant to be for the people it's meant to serve. The money and politics piece of it, you can't discount that. Jamal Bowman is a perfect example. AIPAC and affiliated groups spent $25 million again in a House primary. Right. It is unprecedented in any way you look at it. Of course, there are things like the redistricting that played a big role. There are those kinds of realities too, but $25 million, I mean, holy shit, come on. Yeah. And then the other reality is when you look at the numbers, essentially the communities of color turned out for him in a big way. That still happened. So I think that tells us something as well. The reality is the money in politics is a very real thing. I'm not going to pretend like it's not, but across the country in swing states for months and months and months now, we've seen where the people are is against this invasion, against this occupation, and people have been calling it for a ceasefire. And I'm not one of those people who put all my eggs in the polling basket. I always believe polls are a snapshot in time. They give us some information for that moment. But this has been ongoing for months and months and months now. So the short answer, I think, is the money that is being dumped into these different districts is very real. It's not impossible to overcome being outspent a little bit, but $25 million is damn near impossible. More obviously, we have Cori Bush up next in early August. So everybody, obviously, please do whatever you can for her. But this is a C3 conversation. But we saw Summer Lee. Like, they wanted to pretend like they didn't have anything to do with Summer Lee. They were actively recruiting against her to the very last minute. They couldn't find anybody. Same with Rashida Tlaib, quite frankly. They tried and tried and tried to offer people millions of dollars to run against her, and they couldn't do it. So it's a really tough question, and it sounds so cliche, people power, but I do think it's important. They're always going to have infinity dollars, the APECs of the world, the DMFIs of the world. I'm not saying we give up on that front, but I do think it's important that we continue to coalesce and build these strong coalitions, because we're not going to be able to compete dollar for dollar. It's just not going to happen. But to your point, we are seeing, unfortunately, George Latimer being elected is devastating. I mean, he is not a friend, not even just to Arab Americans and Muslim Americans. I mean, he's not friends to Black and brown people. So it's really unfortunate, but I do still think there's a lot of really great members of Congress that are still there. We still have some races to go. We obviously want to build those majority of thoughtful people who care about humanity and human rights, but it's an ongoing effort for sure.
You know, there's that quote that's apocryphally attributed to Gandhi. First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. We are very much in the then they fight you part of this. And I don't want to be Panglossian about this. I understand the challenge of the amount of money AIPAC and all its affiliates can pour into a campaign, as we've seen, is enormous and intimidating for any candidate. But this is what winning the argument looks like. I mean, we're in a moment right now. I mean, 10 years ago, Apex theory of the case is like, we don't need to directly fund campaigns because everyone agrees with us. That is over. We are very much in a battle right now, and it's out in the open. I constantly think about this quote from Steve Rosen, who was one of AIPAC's lead lobbyists in this article in the New Yorker, it's like 20 years ago, maybe, where he was bragging about AIPAC's powers. That famous interview, he was like, look at this napkin. Within a few hours, I could have 50 senators' names on this napkin. But what he said was, a lobby is like a night flower. It dies in the sunlight. These past years have been the process of drawing AIPAC out into the sunlight, and they have willingly come because this is the fight they have to engage now in a much bigger way. And in doing so, they have enabled us to have a much more honest and forthright conversation about what is actually required to maintain a kind of Israel can do no wrong Congress. And the answer to that is tens upon tens of millions of dollars. Their argument previously was just like, Americans just love Israel. We don't need to do this or that. It's just like we're pushing on an open door. So again, I'm not going to diminish the challenge of all this money, but I do think we are in this stage right now because of the amount of people we have been able to bring out, the arguments we have made, the correct and I think ethical and principled and strategic policy arguments we've made for a shift in policy. I mean, I was very sad. I've known Jamal for a while. I really like him. I'm going to really miss him in Congress. That was painful. There were other factors involved there. I mean, AIPAC identifies what they see as weaker candidates or candidates in more challenging districts who they can then proclaim their power about the fact that they chose, after going absolutely all in against Summer last cycle, like to the extent where they were actually funding in the general, which is even more unprecedented, to step off, not being able to take her down. And again, I think that's reflected in what I was saying earlier. Almost half of the Democratic caucus did not go to the Netanyahu speech. Back in 2011, when Netanyahu spoke in Congress, Tom Friedman wrote, I hope Netanyahu understands that that applause was bought and paid for by the Israel lobby. Well, as of a couple of days ago, the Israel lobby is paying a hell of a lot more for a hell of a lot less. That is where we are.
Rania, this may put you on the spot too much, but I imagine a lot of people are just asking you the question that people have been talking about in this chat, which is, should we vote for Kamala Harris?
So I don't have a good answer yet. Well, maybe we'll have this conversation again. I am in a place myself personally. I mentioned, being cautiously optimistic. I myself am cautiously optimistic. I have had conversations with her team. I haven't met with her yet. I expect that those will be ongoing. But even just the conversations with her team have made me feel like we can make some real progress. I'm not ready to say absolutely 100,000% yes, let's go. I am saying we need to be paying attention. We need to be engaging. And she has to engage us too, quite frankly. So whereas with Biden, I was like, I can't. I mean, Donald Trump terrifies me and is an existential threat and he's a fascist and all the things. With Biden, I can't. I literally cannot do it. And I could never ask anyone else to do it either. I just couldn't. With the vice president, the verdict is still out a bit. I'm inching toward her, but I'm sort of in this place also where I need to see some more things from her. I think all of us do. I want to hear from her more. I want to hear her address. I know I mentioned it already and we've talked about it a little bit, but her address last night was powerful and important in so many ways. And also, I want a little bit more meat on those bones too. So I'm inching there. And when people ask me that question, I just am telling them to pay attention and engage. And we have to keep the pressure on. So this is the thing too that I keep telling people, even with the address and the comments last night that were so great and exactly on the heels of meeting with the prime minister. That was fantastic. That doesn't mean we don't keep pulling every lever. It doesn't mean we don't keep pushing every single policy initiative that we're pushing here. We don't have that luxury. Unfortunately, I think we're all painfully aware of that. So yeah, that's it. Like, keep paying attention. I'm getting there. I'm hopeful, but not fully 100% there yet.
But I want to ask you a different question. The Republican Party's foreign policy message in general has obviously shifted quite a lot from where it was in the George W. Bush years. And you can see that particularly with J.D. Vance, such that Israel now sounds in some ways very much dissonant from the larger message. If the message is basically America first, we don't want to get dragged into foreign conflicts, it's pretty hard to reconcile that with an Israel policy which basically pushes you towards a war with Iran. I'm curious whether you think that this, what seems to me an intellectual inconsistency, incoherence, can be sustained in the Republican Party for years to come, or whether basically there are forces in the Republican Party that are isolationists are going to become more isolationist than Israel. And then how we feel about that, because some of those people on the right who don't like Israel have some disturbing views in general, including sometimes about Jews. So I'm curious where you think the Republican Party is going.
Yeah, I mean, first, I would think it is very sustainable because the biggest Israel lobby, we should note, is the right-wing Christian evangelicals.
Right.
All right. And who are fervently, obviously, pro-Israel. They make up a big part of the Republican base, a big part of the Republican volunteer base in terms of getting out the vote. They are very engaged, and this is a major issue for them for reasons that, yes, are quite troubling. You know, and again, this is, as you know, my community, the evangelical community. Yeah, there's some things that happen later that are not great for the Jews. But I would also say I don't agree with calling the Republican position isolationist. I think it is unilateralist. It is aggressively unilateralist. It is in many ways just basically imperialist, like Trump's argument, because he fancies himself kind of this mob boss type, which is like, listen, if you want to be part of the American protection racket, you need to pay. You need to pay up. We're getting ripped off. You need to pay up. You owe us tribute. That is just straight, kind of imperialism. Trump, you look at his record as president, this was not an isolationist presidency. Yes, it was isolationist in the kind of weird terms of the Washington debate, because he was less crazy about going to Davos or the Munich Security Conference and eating tiny sandwiches and drinking coffee, which is what makes you a real internationalist. And if you don't like doing those things, then obviously you're an isolationist. But I think that's just wrong and very silly. We came close to war with North Korea in 2017, very close to war with Iran in early 2022 after the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. So it's just reckless all over the place. But the basic principle is America is really powerful and we get to do whatever we want. And our friends get to do whatever they want, because that's part of how the protection racket works. So to that extent, I think it's quite consistent, this idea that, well, Israel's one of our friends, so we're going to support them. But another piece of it is, you look at this rising ethno-nationalism, and that is where Israel very much fits. There is a model being promoted by Netanyahu and his right-wing allies, which is, we are the privileged ones, everyone else's citizenship is conditional. Whether it's in Israel, you've got the Hungary model, you've got Bolsonaro in Brazil, and that's basically the view in the Republican Party, is the idea that we are a white Christian nation, and other people can live here as long as you don't get out of line. That's how they want to define the United States of America. And Israel provides a model and in many ways an inspiration for that.
No, I think you're exactly right. And I think you're right. Isolationism is not the right word. I think unilateralism or imperialism is a much better one. Rania, I wanted to give you the last word. This is just a sheer political punditry question. Do you believe that Kamala Harris today is behind? And if so, how much?
I don't think she's behind, simply because Trump came off of some of the highest points that should have given him big bumps. The convention, the attempted assassination, all of these things historically would have shown bumps in the numbers. And it was minuscule. I don't even think they wholly registered. Everything that's come out so far is within the margin of error. I also think, and I was saying this before Biden made his announcement that he would be stepping aside, there's nowhere for him to go. In similar ways, there's nowhere for Trump to go. Vice President Harris, while she's held office for so long, from AG to Senate to, all the things, she's kind of still being learned about by the general population. So I do think it's neck and neck. I think it's within the margin of error. I don't think she's behind. I think it's very tight. But this is where, again, it's incumbent upon her to show people who she is, to call people in that have, there's beef with her from when she was attorney general, and that's real. There's beef with her within the Latino community. It's very real. With young people, also real. And obviously my community too. So this is where I think she has such a massive, massive, massive opportunity to call people in, to have the conversations privately and publicly, and educate people on who she is. And I've seen a lot of people talking about reproductive rights and things like that in the comments. And obviously, yes, there are so many issues that we are facing as a nation, even outside of this specifically, which obviously I deeply care about. I care about a lot of other things too, that she is uniquely positioned to talk about. And she is a stark contrast to Donald Trump. So to me, it's on her. I mean, we all need to do our part and listen and pay attention and challenge her, quite frankly. I'm not about just like everyone falling in line, but it is on her to show us who she is and what she's going to be about.
I think we'll end it there. Rania and Matt, thank you so much. I know you're both really busy these days. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Peter, and thanks, everyone. Thank you, Rania.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, everybody.
And we're not meeting next Friday, so it'll be 2 Fridays from now at 11 a.m. with Fida Giris, who some of you may remember talked to a couple of years ago, the author of a really beautiful memoir about her father and her family, which is called A Stranger in My Own Land. Fida's had a particularly interesting perspective on what's been happening over the last 8 or 9 months, because she's been living in the Galilee and has a lot to say about what's been happening there, which I think is a place that hasn't gotten nearly as much attention given all of the news from Gaza and the West Bank and beyond. So that'll be 2 Fridays from now at 11 a.m. We're not going to be meeting next Friday. And I hope you all have a wonderful weekend.